Payroll data, just absolute disaster, complete mess. Both sides, too. Not only the establishment survey with its gigantic downward revisions, but also the household survey, which suffered massive population controls. While we may not have a good idea of how many Americans are working, well, at least we have some idea of how little work they are actually doing. It's nowhere near enough, that's for sure. And if there are some jobs being gained, they are not the good ones. No wonder consumer confidence is tanking again. But setting aside all the benchmark census-based adjustments, hours didn't grow in the last half of last year, leaving the average work week to match March of 2020 as the lowest since 2010. So again, we don't know how many people might be working every day, but we do know when they get there, they have less and less to do. And that in and of itself strongly implies that payroll estimates are still overstated even after these latest revisions, as does the short-run revisions themselves, which raised job gains in November, December, in what looks like another operation of statistical smoothing. The BLS doesn't seem to have learned anything from overestimating the weaker jobs market the past few years. And this whole mess only makes everything more difficult than it has been and really needs to be. The only thing that we can take away for certain is that employers have indeed forgotten how to hire. After all these benchmark changes, we still don't have a good idea. We don't know how many people are working, but we're pretty sure they don't have a lot of work to do. And so that doesn't settle the argument. That doesn't give us a good sense of one side or the other. Is this a recession? Is it not a recession? Is it heading into recession? Is it not heading into recession? There is stuff that indicates all of the above. But all of that is consistent with the economy that forgot how to grow, the labor market that forgot how to hire. We just don't know how weak it has been, or at least don't have any confidence in how weak it has been, nor do we have a whole lot of confidence given all of these changes about what that means for this year, at least in more specific terms. In broad terms, the situation is as it has been. So let's start with the CPS or household survey, where the unemployment rate comes from, and the level of employment, the labor force, all of those numbers. And it starts with population, the civilian non-institutional population, because that's how the BLS puts together the CPS numbers. It starts with the number of estimated people there are in the potential labor pool, the civilian non-institutional population, and then sort of estimates how many of those people fall into different categories and how many people in those different categories might be working or not working, might be in the labor market looking for a job or may not be. So whenever the Census Bureau, as it does every year, changes its estimates for what they think the population is, the BLS has to adjust the CPS side of the survey for those changes in population. But rather than doing it like they do in the establishment survey, where they take the new benchmark and then work backward to revise how things had gone in the previous years, for these CPS numbers with these population control factors, the government doesn't really, they just apply them all at once. And the one for January was absolutely enormous. As the press release itself said, Table B shows this population adjustment increased the estimated size of the civilian non-institutional population age 16 and over in December by 2.9 million. The increases in population were relatively large for Asians and Hispanics. The adjustment increased the total civilian labor force by 2.1 million, including increases of 2 million in employment and 105,000 in unemployment. The number of people not in the labor force increased by 765,000. Although the effect on levels was relatively large, the effect on rates and ratios was small, and that's really the important point. The adjustment increased the total unemployment rate, employment population ratio, and labor force participation rate by 0.1 of a percentage point each. So what they're saying is not that the level of employment increased by 2 million in December or in January. What they're saying is they had understated the level of people that there are in the country, and that they therefore had understated how many people were actually working overall, because it flows down from the population. So if the census raised their population estimate for last year, so basically the Census Bureau raised the number of people in the United States for the last couple of years, and so the BLS adjusted their levels of employment by the same proportions. It wasn't a greater proportion. There isn't a better labor market. There's just more people, and therefore the BLS assumes there's more people working. And by the way, they do this every single year. There are population control factors, and there have been some big ones in previous years. So they do this annual change every single year, and it makes interpretation and comparisons increasingly difficult. In fact, you look at the participation rate, they only raised it, as I said in the press release, by 1/10 of a percentage point to 62.6%, and it was 65% during the fourth quarter of last year, still down from the 62.8% at the peak in 2023. And that leaves the labor force shrinking. Even though the labor force overall is thought to have been bigger over the last couple of years, the trajectory is what remains the same. And that's really the point here. Even though there's more people working, the overall trajectory, even though the levels were raised, heading forward into 2025 and 2026 continues to be in the wrong direction. The employment population ratio still 60.1%, and it's been 60 to 60.4%. Basically, again, same trajectory. So they raise the level of people, therefore people working, but the direction of travel is the same anyway. But the unemployment rate did dip down to 4.0% because when you get past all of these population control factors and big changes in all these levels, it left there some positive gain in payrolls aside from population factors in the month of January. And with the labor force only growing a little bit outside of the population adjustments, that meant that the rate could go down from 4.1% in December to 4.0%. Again, it doesn't actually change anything. It's just the BLS trying to work with a different set of numbers, which all flow from the Census Bureau's estimates of the overall population. So Census Bureau said more people. The BLS says, well, there's more people working. That doesn't change anything about where we're going, only where we had been. So the last couple of years, the gap to the 2010s baseline, which is what we should really be using to measure all of these things, all these economic accounts. Are we actually recovering? Are we forgetting how to grow? How do we know? Well, if we have fewer jobs and fewer people employed than we should have been coming out of the 2010s, which wasn't all that great of a period, that means it's not a recovery even if the level shifts. So with the new population control factors, the household survey is still 6.7 million short in January 2025 of where it really should be, where it really needs to be. In December, it was 8.7 million short. There were these 2 million additional people likely working the last few years. We just didn't know they were there because census didn't estimate them. But whether it's a 6.7 million gap or an 8.7 million gap, it really doesn't matter because it's multiple millions short of a recovery. It's still the same trajectory. It's still the same labor market, if slightly raised because of the number of people. At 6.7 million, that gap is just absolutely enormous. So whether 6.7 million or 8.7 million, what really matters here is whether or not the labor market is moving in the direction that is closing the gap. What these population control updates show is that the gap was narrower than previously thought, but still growing. So it wasn't as extreme, it's still extreme, but rather than closing that gap, the trajectory remains the same. And that's the only takeaway. That's the real takeaway here. It's not the level, it's where we go from here on out. But over on the other side of the ledger, the establishment survey, the CES numbers. First of all, you had a disappointing headline change after the benchmark revisions conducted for the month of January, but then, as I predicted, they substantially raised the monthly changes for both November and December. So it was 143,000 net change in January, which is the first actual miss to expectations in quite a few months, going back to October, which was blamed, of course, on the storms. December was revised up from initially 256 to 307,000, so 50,000 additional job gains there. In November, which was initially estimated at 227, is now 261,000. So we've got almost a combined almost 100,000 additional job gains in November and December, and then the miss in January. So is the labor market actually growing? Is it strengthening? Is it surging? Or is this another one of those statistical smoothing operations that we've seen time and time again with these annual benchmark revisions? I'll get through the benchmark revisions in just a second. But what I wrote yesterday at our deep dive analysis, I predicted that this was going to happen. Like I said, we've seen this before. What I wrote on Thursday was, I don't expect them to completely alter anyone's interpretation, talking about the benchmark changes, probably showing how the labor market was exceptionally weak from the middle of 2023, around the same time when the British economy was getting into its first technical recession. But we already knew that. In other words, the revisions will simply move the establishment survey closer to the household survey where the QCEW has already been. And the household survey moves a little bit toward the establishment survey in the population control factors. But what happens after that is anyone's guess. For all we know, the BLS will take that weakness and then statistically smooth it out with even higher monthly gains the rest of 2024. And that's exactly what they did. While that may sound absurd, the previous few benchmark revisions ended up with largely those results. So this time, it's going to be a far greater downward rewrite. So that's what we saw. We got the benchmark revisions, which lowered the establishment survey count of payrolls across the economy, really from, get this, March of 2023 till around July of 2024. March of 2023, as I pointed out in a recent video, Fed won the bank battle, but lost the overall macroeconomic, especially banking war. Meaning that right from around that time, when yield curves went crazy, when bond markets started ignoring Fed rate hikes and ECB rate hikes, that was March of 2023. And we see that it did have an impact in the US labor market too. So while you see weakness around the rest of the world that's more pronounced, here we do have an indication that it did have a negative impact on the US labor market. The question is, given all these revisions, do we have any confidence that we know how much weakness has developed since then? So under the old benchmarks that were being used up until last month, between March of 2023, starting with March of 2023 through up to and including July 2024, the old benchmarks show that there were 3.63 million jobs gained in those 17 months, or about 214,000 per month, which was a pretty sharp step down from the preceding period. And as I said, that left the job market substantially below where it needed to be for full recovery. The new benchmarks put that about 700,000 jobs further away. Instead of 3.63 million, now the benchmarks say just 2.92 million, or 172,000 per month. And a lot of people say, what's the difference? 214 versus 172, that doesn't seem like a whole big deal. But when you're already well short of where you need to be, slowing down even more when that wasn't even enough to begin with under the old benchmarks means you get further and further behind. So the level goes down a little bit from the establishment survey, and it also doesn't change the trajectory. Although there is a little bit of a trajectory change at the end, which I just mentioned, and that was the BLS doing what it always does. Because with the establishment survey, it is highly smoothed out. But even with that statistical smoothing, even with those upward revisions to November and December, it still leaves the establishment survey even further behind than it was previously. So according to the prior benchmarks, the gap to the trend line was about 4.6 million short of full recovery. With the new benchmarks, it's about 5.3 million short, even with November and December speeding up further than they had been. So either way you look at it, we don't know how much, we don't have a whole lot of confidence in how far we are behind full recovery in the labor market. But we do know with pretty reasonable certainty that we are we're way too far behind what would be considered an actual recovery, which is what we actually need. Certainly that's what consumers need, and that's why the economy has forgot how to grow. Because not only did consumers and workers and businesses and a whole bunch of others get pounded with lost purchasing power in 2021 and 2022, the labor market never recovered. So they have no way to getting back that lost purchasing power, in addition to the fact that most of those people know there's not much opportunity in future moving forward either. It's compounding major negatives that gets lost in the shuffle of all of these revisions and changes and price illusion and everything else that mainstream economics does nothing to help clear up. What didn't get revised really all that much, even though this was on the establishment survey side, was the hours index and the average work week, which they're increasingly grim here. And they suggest that the labor market, like the household survey, the trajectory is getting worse regardless of this argument and misestimations over levels. So if the benchmark revisions didn't alter anyone's interpretation about where the labor market stands, the hours index really should, especially the average work week. The hours index itself down 2 months in a row, so December and January. So even though the overall count of payrolls in November and December, according to the establishment survey, were up, hours worked moving in the wrong direction, down 0.1% in December and 0.2% in January. That leaves the index basically flat going all the way back to March of last year. And this is on the new benchmark changes. And so you do the math here and calculate the average work week. And for January 2025, it was 34.1. 34.1 is solid recession territory. In fact, 34.1 is equal to March of 2020 at the worst part of the lockdowns, the initial pandemic period back in 2020. And those are the lowest that we've seen for the average work week going all the way back to the middle of 2010 in the immediate aftermath of the Great Not Recession. So by the view of the hours index and the average work week, the labor market is in serious trouble. Whatever you make of the establishment survey, the payroll, the headline number, the hours index looks a lot more like the household survey, especially the trajectory. Whatever the levels of people, number of people working, the trajectory, hours worked, utilization, that hasn't changed. So even if you're willing to take the establishment survey at face value, which given the statistical smoothing, you really shouldn't, but even if you were, the best case interpretation of the more recent changes in the establishment survey is that employers were increasingly positive, optimistic about, first of all, the Fed's rate cuts, because there are people out there who believe in the magic of rate cuts. So some people got more optimistic. Then you had the presidential election and the perception of a more business-friendly environment. So maybe there were some businesses out there that began hiring workers in anticipation of an uptick, an actual uptick in the economy at some point. So they brought a bunch of workers in. That's why the November, December numbers look so much better. But then they didn't have anything for them to do, which is why hours didn't change and the average work week fell. So at the margins, you have more people brought in anticipating some work for them to do, but the work never showed up, at least not through January. How long are they going to hold on to those workers? Again, that's the best case, most charitable interpretation of the data. They were excited about something only to be disappointed. We see that all over the economy, consumer confidence numbers and a whole bunch of others that are rolling over after these artificial one-off factors. And the fact that it may have hit the labor markets, assuming that the establishment survey numbers for November and December are real, which again shouldn't do, that suggests that pulled forward not just demand into the end of last year, but also hiring activity as well. But overall, what these statistics are supposed to do, they're supposed to help us settle these questions of interpretation. Is the U.S. economy in a recession? Has it achieved its soft landing? Or did it forget how to grow? And really, the forget how to grow, that's my euphemism, because a lot of people don't like the term recession. They don't want to apply it to these conditions because they have preconceived notions of what a recession must look like. And for them, a recession must look like the payroll reports are absolutely crashing. When a recession can take a whole bunch of different forms, including forgot how to grow. So to me, this is exactly like a recession, a prolonged recession, though, because it's so far below recovery levels and because it is so protracted, it's actually more like a depression than a recession, which is a term that people like even less. So we'll just call it forget how to grow. And that actually fits the data that we have. So you don't like recession, you don't like that term because you have preconceived notion and preconceived definitions of what a recession is supposed to look like. Fine, we'll call it forgot how to grow. And setting aside all of these arguments over benchmark revisions and questionable changes and everything else, that's what we're left with. Regardless of the level here, the trajectory remains and the condition remains. The economy forgot how to grow because it forgot how to hire. None of that's actually true. It didn't forget how to do anything. We're in a prolonged, protracted recession that just doesn't look like a recession that most people imagine. And this is where the labor data is supposed to come in and help clear up all of these interpretations. But instead, with all these massive changes, it's doing the exact opposite. So we have more people, but fewer payrolls, less hours, a lot less hours. All of that adds up to, at the very least, forgot how to grow. I mentioned March of 2023 for all these revisions and where the benchmarks started. The banking panic. The Fed that may have won the battle but lost the war. That's the video link below. As always, thank you very much for joining me. Huge thank you, Eurodollar University members and subscribers. And until next time, take care.